It all started on a Tuesday morning, the kind where the sun shines just right through the curtains, making everything feel calm and normal. I was standing in my kitchen, sipping coffee while flipping through emails on my phone. Life was good, or at least it seemed that way until I saw it. A plain white envelope lying on the floor near the door. At first glance, it looked harmless, like junk mail or some advertisement for a local business. But something about it felt off. I picked it up, turned it over, and noticed there was no stamp. Someone had hand-delivered this. My name was typed neatly in bold letters. Mr. Ethan Hayes. No Dear Ethan, no friendly greeting. Just my name staring back at me like an accusation. I tore open the envelope, pulled out the paper inside, and started reading. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Dear Mr. Hayes, it began, written in stiff, formal language. It went on to explain that because of some vague rule buried deep in the HOA agreement, a document I hadn't even glanced at when buying the house, I now owed them money. Not just any amount either. Hundreds of dollars every month. They called it a maintenance fee increase. But here's the kicker. Apparently, if I didn't pay, they could slap me with fines, penalties, and even threaten to kick me out of my own home. Kick me out. For my own house. At first, I thought it was a prank. Maybe one of my neighbors was messing with me. Or maybe it was some kind-hearted soul trying to teach me a lesson about reading fine print. But as I read further, the tone of the letter grew colder, more serious. There were warnings about legal action, deadlines, and phrases like, non-compliance will result in immediate consequences. Consequences. What did that even mean? Were they going to send someone to drag me out of my living room? I set the letter down on the counter and stared at it for a long time. My mind raced. How could this be happening? I worked hard for this house. Every brick, every tile, every late-night mortgage payment. It was mine. Paid off. Done. Free and clear. And now some group of people I barely knew wanted to charge me rent for it. It didn't make sense. It wasn't fair. When my wife, Claire, walked into the kitchen a few minutes later, I handed her the letter without saying a word. She scanned it quickly, her eyebrows knitting together in confusion. "What is this?" she asked, looking up at me. "I don't know," I admitted, "but it feels like trouble." Claire shook her head, muttering something under her breath about how ridiculous it sounded. We both laughed nervously, trying to convince ourselves it wasn't a big deal. Surely there had been a mistake. Maybe the HOA sent the wrong letter to the wrong person, or maybe it was some kind of clerical error. Whatever it was, we decided to ignore it, for now. But ignoring things never makes them go away. Over the next few days, the letter haunted me. I'd catch myself thinking about it during meetings at work, while helping our son with homework, even when brushing my teeth before bed. Something about it gnawed at me, like a splinter lodged under my skin. Deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And then, 2 days later, she showed up. Karen herself, standing on my porch like she owned the neighborhood. That's when things really got interesting. The knock on the door came early in the morning, just as I was finishing my second cup of coffee. It wasn't loud, but it carried a certain authority. 3 sharp raps that made me glance up from the newspaper I'd been half-heartedly reading. I wasn't expecting anyone, so curiosity got the better of me. Setting my mug down, I walked to the door and opened it. There she was, Margaret Whitmore, president of the Willow Ridge Homeowners Association. She looked exactly like you'd imagine someone in her position would. Immaculately dressed, not a hair out of place, holding a clipboard like it was some kind of royal scepter. Her oversized sunglasses perched on top of her head gave her an air of superiority, like she'd stepped straight out of a reality TV show about suburban drama. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I see you received our notice." "Our notice," I repeated, crossing my arms over my chest. I tried to keep my tone neutral, but there was no hiding the edge creeping into my voice. "You mean the letter demanding money for something I already own?" She tilted her head slightly, studying me as if I were a puzzle she needed to solve. Well, technically, yes, we can request those fees. See, the HOA has certain rights over the property. If you don't comply with our regulations. She paused dramatically, letting the implication hang in the air like smoke. Things could get complicated. Complicated. What did that even mean? My jaw tightened, and I had to fight the urge to roll my eyes. Instead, I took a step closer, narrowing the gap between us. Let me get this straight. You're telling me I have to pay rent to live in my own house. A house I've paid off completely. Her expression shifted ever so slightly, almost imperceptibly. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of doubt, or maybe irritation, but then her practiced smile returned. It's not rent here. It's a maintenance fee. Everyone contributes to ensure the upkeep of the community. Pools, landscaping, security, all these things cost money. I blinked at her. Was she serious? So what happens if I refuse to pay? Her smile faltered again, just for a split second, before snapping back into place. Well, let's hope it doesn't come to that. Non-compliance leads to penalties, legal action, and potentially eviction. The word landed like a bomb, heavy and final. Eviction. From my own home. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This woman, who lived 3 streets away, was standing on my porch threatening to throw me out of a house I'd worked years to afford. It felt surreal, like I'd wandered into some twisted episode of a soap opera. But this wasn't fiction. This was real life. You can't be serious, I said finally, shaking my head. This is absurd. I bought this house outright. There's no mortgage, no lion, nothing tying me to your organization beyond basic courtesy. You can't just invent rules and expect me to follow them. Margaret adjusted her sunglasses, clearly unfazed by my outburst. These aren't invented rules, Mr. Hayes. They're outlined in the HOA agreement you signed when purchasing the property. Surely you read it. Of course, I hadn't read it. Who does? When you buy a house, you're handed stacks of papers thicker than a phone book, and you sign wherever they tell you to because you're too excited, or too exhausted, to care. At the time, all I cared about was getting the keys to my new home. Now that oversight felt like a colossal mistake. Margaret sighed, feigning disappointment. If only you'd taken the time to understand your obligations, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But here we are. So what will it be, Mr. Hayes? Will you cooperate, or do we need to escalate matters? Cooperate. That word grated on me. Cooperate with what? Extortion. Blackmail. Whatever this was, it wasn't cooperation. It was coercion. And yet, standing there, staring at her smug face, I realized I had 2 choices. Give in or fight back. Neither option seemed appealing. But one thing was clear. I wasn't going down without a fight. The meeting was set for Thursday evening, and by the time I arrived at the Willow Ridge Clubhouse, my nerves were frayed. The building itself was unremarkable. A single-story structure with beige walls, fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead, and rows of uncomfortable plastic chairs arranged in neat lines. It looked like a place where excitement went to die. Still, the room was packed. Neighbors I barely knew sat stiffly in their seats, clutching notebooks or scrolling through their phones, avoiding eye contact with each other. The air felt tense, charged with an undercurrent of unease. At the front of the room stood Margaret Whitmore, flanked by her loyal deputies, Grave, the vice president, who always seemed to be nodding too enthusiastically, and Cheryl, the treasurer, whose sharp features made her look perpetually annoyed. Together, they formed what I like to call the HOA Triumvirate, a trio of self-appointed overlords determined to micromanage every blade of grass and shade of paint in the neighborhood. They exuded confidence, as if they truly believed they were running a Fortune 500 company instead of a sleepy suburban community. Margaret cleared her throat dramatically, tapping her pen against the podium to silence the low murmur of conversation. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice dripping with fake warmth. "As many of you know, we've been facing challenges with compliance lately." Her eyes flicked toward me briefly before continuing. And unfortunately, some residents seem intent on undermining the harmony of our community. Harmony? Was that what they called bullying people into submission these days? I clenched my fists under the table, forcing myself to stay calm. This wasn't the time to lose my temper, not yet, anyway. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up slowly, gripping the edge of the table to steady myself. All eyes turned to me, some curious, others hostile. A few neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly uneasy about the confrontation brewing before them. "This isn't about harmony," I said firmly, my voice cutting through the tense silence. "It's about control. You're trying to strong-arm me into paying for something I already own, because I won't play by your ridiculous rules." The room erupted into murmurs. Some nodded sympathetically, others glared daggers at me. Margaret smirked, clearly enjoying the drama. "Mr. Hayes, if you'd simply cooperate," I interrupted, my voice rising slightly, "by handing over my hard-earned money for no reason other than your greed. No thanks." Her smirk vanished. Game on. The fallout from the meeting was immediate and brutal. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a crack forming in a dam before the floodwaters rush through. At first, it was just little things. Neighbors I'd waved to for years suddenly avoiding eye contact, pretending not to see me as I passed by. Cheryl from the HOA board walked her dog past my house one evening and muttered under her breath, "This isn't worth it, you know. Just pay them. Pay them." As if it were that simple. As if I hadn't worked myself to the bone to buy this house, to build a life here. Her words stung, but they weren't the worst part. The notes came next. Anonymous letters began appearing under my door or tucked into my mailbox. Some were typed, others handwritten in jagged scrawl, but the message was always the same. "You're ruining everything. Why can't you just follow the rules? If you don't like it here, leave." Each one felt like a punch to the gut, designed to isolate me, to make me feel like an outsider in my own neighborhood. But the isolation wasn't limited to adults. My son, Lucas, noticed it too. One afternoon, he came home from playing outside looking dejected. When I asked what was wrong, he shrugged and mumbled, "The kids won't play with me anymore. They said their parents told them not to." That hit me harder than anything else. Seeing my 8-year-old sitting on the porch alone, kicking at pebbles because his friends had been ordered to stay away. It broke something inside me. Claire tried to comfort him, telling him it would all blow over soon, but we both knew better. This wasn't going away anytime soon. Then there were the rumors. Whispers spread faster than wildfire in Willow Ridge, and every conversation seemed to circle back to me. People claimed I was suing the HOA. I wasn't, not yet anyway, that I was trying to bankrupt the association, or that I was some kind of troublemaker determined to destroy the community values everyone held so dear. None of it was true, but truth rarely matters when fear takes hold. Fear of rocking the boat. Fear of standing out. Fear of crossing Margaret Whitmore. One evening, as I sat on the porch nursing a cup of coffee, Greg, the HOA vice president, walked by with his golden retriever. He stopped briefly, glancing at me with an expression that hovered somewhere between pity and disdain. "Look, Ethan," he said, his tone measured, "we don't want this to get ugly. Just fall in line. Pay the fees. It's easier for everyone." Easier? Was that what this was about? Making life easier for people who didn't want to deal with conflict. I stared at him, incredulous. Fall in line. So I should just hand over my money because you say so. Because Margaret says so. Greg shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his collar. "It's not personal, okay? It's just how things work around here." How things work. That phrase stuck with me long after he left. It wasn't personal, he'd said, but it felt deeply personal. Every note shoved under my door, every cold shoulder from a neighbor, every whispered rumor. It all felt like a direct attack on my family, and our right to live peacefully in our own home. Claire tried to reason with me later that night. Maybe we should just pay them, she suggested softly, her voice tinged with exhaustion. Just to make it stop. For Lucas's sake. For Lucas's sake. I shot back, frustration bubbling over. Do you think giving in will fix this? Do you think they'll stop once they realize they've won? This isn't about money. It's about power. And if we give them an inch, they'll take a mile. She didn't argue, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. Doubt in me, in my ability to fight back without tearing our lives apart. Maybe she was right to worry. Maybe I was biting off more than I could chew. But backing down wasn't an option, not when it meant surrendering the very thing we'd worked so hard to build. Our home, our pride, our freedom. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized something important. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, even if it meant standing alone. Things escalated quickly after that. It wasn't just anonymous notes or cold shoulders anymore. The HOA turned up the pressure, hitting me with one violation after another in rapid succession. Every morning seemed to bring a new orange sticker slapped across my garage door or mailbox post. Bright, glaring reminders of their control. Violation. Unsafe taking. A firewood. Violation. Improper land aping. Violation. Recycling bin left outside past 7 a.m. It was absurd. The firewood, neatly stacked against the side of the house, exactly where it had been for years. Landscaping. My yard looked better than half the neighborhood's. Recycling bin. Seriously. I'd left it out 5 minutes past the deadline because I'd overslept. And yet each infraction came with a fine. $50 here, $100 there. By the end of the week, the total owed had ballooned into thousands of dollars. Claire and I sat at the kitchen table one evening, staring at the stack of notices. She rubbed her temples, looking defeated. "This is insane," she muttered. "They're punishing us for breathing." I slammed my fist on the table, making her jump. That's the point. They want to break us, wear us down until we either pay them or move out. "But what are we supposed to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We can't keep fighting this. It's not fair to Lucas. He's already losing his friends. People won't even talk to us anymore." Her words hit hard, but they didn't change anything. Giving in wasn't an option. Not when it meant surrendering to something so blatantly wrong. Still, I couldn't deny the toll it was taking. Our son barely smiled these days, retreating into video games instead of playing outside like he used to. Claire snapped at small things. A burnt dinner, a misplaced set of keys, and spent hours scrolling through legal forums late at night, searching for answers we didn't have. Then came the final straw. One morning, as I backed my car out of the driveway, I noticed something strange taped to my windshield. Another notice, but this one was different. It wasn't about fines or violations. It was an official-looking document declaring that if I didn't settle my account within 7 days, the HOA would begin proceedings to evict me from my property. Evict me from my own home. I crumpled the paper in my hand, anger boiling over. How could they do this? How could anyone think this was acceptable? I stormed back inside, grabbed my phone, and started calling lawyers. Most wouldn't take the case, claiming it was too complicated or not worth their time. But then I found her. Rita Alvarez, a no-nonsense attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. Her website promised results, and her voice during our initial call radiated confidence. "This isn't right," she said bluntly after hearing my story. "And more importantly, it's not legal. Let's dig into their records. If they're doing this to you, chances are they've done it to others too." Working with Rita felt like finally having backup in a war I'd been fighting alone. She requested copies of the HOA's financial statements, meeting minutes, and bylaws. What we uncovered was staggering. Funds earmarked for community improvements had disappeared without explanation. Maintenance contracts went to companies owned by board members' relatives. Fines collected from homeowners weren't deposited into legitimate accounts. They were funneled elsewhere, lining pockets instead of fixing potholes. Armed with evidence, I felt a flicker of hope for the first time in weeks. Maybe this fight wasn't hopeless after all. But as I stood in my living room that night, staring at the stack of documents spread across the coffee table, I knew the hardest battles were still ahead. The HOA wouldn't go down without a fight, and neither would I. The moment we filed the lawsuit, it felt like throwing a match into dry brush. The whole neighborhood exploded with tension, and suddenly, Willow Ridge wasn't just a quiet suburban community. It was the center of attention. News outlets picked up the story faster than I expected. Reporters showed up on our street, microphones in hand, cameras rolling as they interviewed neighbors and captured footage of my house. Headlines screamed things like, "Homeowner fights back against HOA overreach," and "Willow Ridge residents rally against alleged corruption." It was surreal to see my life splashed across newspapers and TV screens, but it also gave me a strange sense of power. For once, the spotlight wasn't on me alone. It was on them. Margaret Whitmore and her cronies scrambled to respond, holding emergency meetings behind closed doors and issuing carefully worded statements denying any wrongdoing. But Rita, my lawyer, made sure the truth came out. She leaked documents showing how funds had been misused, how fines were fabricated, and how homeowners like me were being targeted for daring to question authority. Every revelation chipped away at the HOA's facade of respectability. Margaret's polished image cracked under the weight of scrutiny, revealing the petty tyrant beneath. But the backlash wasn't all positive. Some neighbors sided with the HOA, accusing me of causing trouble and ruining property values. Anonymous comments flooded online articles about the case. He should have just followed the rules. This is why people hate living near complainers. Others stopped talking to us entirely, crossing the street when they saw me coming or pulling their kids away from Lucas. Even Mrs. Thompson, who'd quietly warned me about Margaret weeks earlier, avoided eye contact now, pretending not to notice when I waved hello. Still, cracks began forming in the HOA's grip. Other homeowners started speaking out, first one, then another, until a small group of us formed a coalition. We shared stories of intimidation, unfair fines, and bizarre rules no one could possibly follow. One neighbor admitted she'd been fined $500 because her mailbox was painted half an inch too tall. Another said he'd been charged for having a bird bath in his front yard. Slowly, the narrative shifted. People realized this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all of us. Rita encouraged us to organize protests outside the HOA clubhouse. At first, only a handful of brave souls joined me, holding signs that read, "Fair rules, not extortion," and "Our homes, our rights." But as word spread, more residents showed up, some curious, others angry, many fed up with years of silent resentment. Seeing our numbers grow gave me hope. Maybe we weren't as powerless as they wanted us to believe. Meanwhile, Margaret tried to fight back, hosting town halls where she insisted the HOA was acting in everyone's best interest. But her usual charm fell flat. When pressed with questions about missing funds or questionable contracts, she stumbled over her answers, her voice rising defensively. By the end of one particularly heated meeting, several attendees walked out in disgust, muttering about how they'd been blind to the corruption all along. As the legal battle dragged on, stress became a constant companion. Claire worried endlessly about the cost of hiring Rita, even though we agreed it was worth every penny. Lucas struggled to adjust to his shrinking circle of friends, though he tried to hide his sadness by burying himself in books and puzzles. Nights were the hardest. I'd lie awake replaying conversations, wondering if I'd pushed too far or not hard enough. But every time doubt crept in, I reminded myself why I was doing this. Not just for me, but for everyone who deserved better. Finally, after months of fighting, the court ruled in our favor. The judge dismantled the HOA's leadership structure, ordering full restitution for affected homeowners and demanding transparency moving forward. Margaret resigned immediately, disappearing from the neighborhood without so much as a goodbye. The rest of the board disbanded, leaving behind a shell of an organization desperate to rebuild trust. Standing on my porch the day the verdict came down, I felt a mix of relief and exhaustion, and something else, faint but undeniable: pride. We'd taken on a bully and won. And maybe, just maybe, Willow Ridge could finally become the kind of place where people didn't live in fear. The victory was sweet, but it didn't come without scars. Willow Ridge bore the marks of months of conflict, strained relationships, whispered resentments, and a lingering sense of unease that wouldn't disappear overnight. Still, there were signs of healing. Slowly, hesitantly, life began to return to normal, or at least something resembling it. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery hues, Cheryl from the HOA walked by with her dog. She paused awkwardly, glancing at me like she wasn't sure what to say. "Look," she started, her voice softer than usual. "I'm sorry for everything." Things got out of hand. Her apology caught me off guard. Part of me wanted to dismiss it, to remind her how much damage they'd done. But instead I nodded. "It's not just me you need to apologize to," I said evenly. "A lot of people here have been hurt." She looked down, twisting the leash in her hands. "I know. And I think we all learned something from this mess." With that, she continued down the street, leaving me to wonder if maybe, just maybe, some bridges could be rebuilt. Over time, other neighbors began reaching out too. Mrs. Thompson brought over a plate of cookies one afternoon, explaining that she hadn't meant to distance herself. It was fear, she admitted, that kept her silent. Fear of retaliation, of becoming the next target. I accepted her gesture graciously, knowing it must have taken courage to step forward after so long. Lucas noticed the change first. One Saturday morning, he came running inside breathless and grinning, announcing that 2 kids from down the block had asked him to join their game of soccer in the cul-de-sac. Claire and I exchanged hopeful smiles as we watched him grab his ball and race outside. It wasn't perfect. He still had a long way to go before he fully trusted his peers again, but it was progress. As for the HOA, the new leadership promised reform. They held open forums where residents could voice concerns without fear of retribution, and every decision was documented and shared publicly. The days of secret meetings and unexplained fees seemed to be behind us, at least for now. Whether the changes would stick remained to be seen, but the effort alone gave me hope. Still, the experience left its mark on me. I found myself looking at Willow Ridge differently, not as a battleground, but as a work in progress, a place where mistakes had been made, lessons learned, and growth possible. I realized that fighting for fairness wasn't just about winning. It was about planting seeds for a better future. One crisp autumn evening, Claire and I stood together on the porch, sipping hot cocoa, while Lucas played tag with his friends under the golden glow of streetlights. For the first time in months, the air felt lighter, freer. "Do you think things will ever really go back to normal?" Claire asked quietly. "No," I replied honestly, "but maybe that's okay. Normal wasn't working before. This is our chance to make it better." And better it became. Neighbors who once avoided each other struck up conversations during weekend walks. People organized potluck dinners and holiday parties, rediscovering the joy of community. Even Greg, the former vice president, showed up to help clean out the neglected flower beds near the entrance gate, muttering something about starting fresh. Standing there, surrounded by laughter and light, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the home I'd fought so hard to protect, but for the reminder that even in the darkest moments, people can come together to create something meaningful. Willow Ridge wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was ours, and that made all the difference.